welcome back. I hope you all managed to find some good places to eat. We're here now for our second panel of the day, Layla and Trauma, and chairing this panel is the lovely Rianna Walcott, who is a PhD candidate at King's College London, researching Black identity formation in digital spaces, and she's a graduate twice over from the University of Edinburgh. She co-founded projectmyopia.com, a website you should all write down immediately, a website that promotes diversity in academia and a decolonised curriculum. She frequently writes and interviews about feminism, race, and literature for publications including Guilaine, Days, The Skinny, HuffPost, the BBC, and The Guardian. Rianna is Associate Editor for it is now out and available outside on our Lighthouse bookstall. It's an anthology about EAME, mental health, the colour of madness. And in her spare time, which apparently exists,
it doesn't.
In her time left over, she moonlights as a professional jazz singer. Her work can be found
Semi.
Professional jazz singer. Her work can be found at... Is there an echo? Her work can be found at RiannaWalcott.com, and she tweets at Rianna_Walcott. Let's give a round of applause for that.
Hello everyone, it was lovely to see this turnout and thank you so much for having me today. This panel is about labour and trauma. So just a little bit about the panel. People of colour are often expected to be translator and tour guide during racial discourse and supply emotional labour at the expense of our well-being. Why are we expected to code switch, manage our feelings and teach white people while putting our own mental health on the back burner? So I'll just start by introducing our panellists. On my right, we have Dr. Erica McInnis, and her list of achievements cover pages, but I'll try and keep it concise. So Erica is Director and Principal Chartered Clinical Psychologist with Nubia Wellness and Healing. She's currently the International Relations Representative on the National Board of Directors of the Association of Black Psychologists, a not-for-profit organisation based in the USA. Dr. McInnis launched emotional emancipation circles in Manchester and many more, and more recently London, and also the UK chapter of the Association of Black Psychologists, for which she's currently secretary. She has full membership of the British Psychological Society and is a practicing psychologist registered with the Health and Care Professionals Council. Dr. McInnis has 22 years of experience working for the National Health Services and currently facilitates African psychology seminars, presentations, and workshops to further the Black community recovering from enslavement and colonisation trauma react. Dr. McInnis specialises in African psychology with a focus on African-centred approaches to wellness and healing in people of African descent. On my left, soon-to-be Dr. Guilaine Kinouani, a feminist and equality consultant, a therapist and writer. Her analysis are rooted in her social location as a Black French woman, a migrant, and a proud child of the banlieue with solid roots in Africa. She's currently completing her doctorate in clinical psychology, and she has her Viva soon, so soon we'll have Dr. Kinouani. Yeah.
So you've probably seen her prolific Twitter at Guilaine, and more of her writing on her website, racereflections.co.uk. And she's also personally blessed me with a foreword to my book on BAME mental health, The Colour of Madness. And last but not least, we have Amal Azzudin on the end. Amal is a campaigner for human rights and social justice in Scotland. She's the Human Rights and Equality Officer for Refugees at the Mental Health Foundation and is also well known as one of the Glasgow Girls, a group of 7 schoolgirls from Drumchapel High School who campaigned to stand up against dawn raids, detention and deportation of asylum seekers in Glasgow. The Glasgow Girls' story has since been turned into 2 BBC documentaries, a stage musical, and a television musical drama. That's so lit. She continues to campaign and has visited refugees in Greece and Calais as an ambassador for the Scottish Refugee Council. So I want to run this panel slightly differently. I'm going to ask some questions, but if any of these questions spark anything in you guys, I want the mic to be roving the whole way so that we can go deeper into any of the discussions you want to have at the time, rather than that whole me asking questions, then only 15 minutes for you guys. So I'll just start with a wide question to my panel.
What would the anti-racist future of mental health care look like? Is it possible to radically deconstruct a discipline that for so long perceived and examined its subjects and theories through a white gaze? So I'll start with Dr. McInnis.
Well, when you're asking about what it's going to be like in the future, I think for black people, we've got to look to the past. We've got to do a bit of a Sankofa and look at the best of African culture and the best of how we were before we were colonised, before we were enslaved, to then know how we can then have a healthcare system that reflects the issues that affect us, that reflects, you know, the best of wisdom for black people. So when you're thinking about the future, I think we've really got to kind of like, to me, it's going to lean towards African psychology.
I wasn't finished writing my
Oh,
answer.
sorry. Do you want to go?
Would you like to? I think working with asylum seekers and refugees, one of the things that comes across a lot is the lack of knowledge about different cultures when it comes to staff, and also lack of awareness about what people are entitled to, because there's a difference between asylum seekers and refugees, and quite a lot of people don't realize the difference between that, and that I think causes a lot of mental health problems as well. So I think training staff and also involving people of color in the conversation and the design of mental health services as well to better suit people from different backgrounds.
Okay, so I'd say three things I think seems quite important to me, and the first one is addressing the whiteness of psychology and of mental health profession and their roots in colonialism and in their complicity in white supremacy. I don't think that we have started the conversation within psychology in terms of why is our curriculum white and why are we silent around the whiteness of our curriculum. So that's one, I think that's one big area to address. There's something around addressing the structural racism which goes on within mental health services and the disproportionate violence that people of color, and particularly black people, continue to face, and we have known that for 2, 3, 4, possibly even half a century. They don't seem to abate. If anything, they are getting worse. So I don't think that we are doing enough in terms of those inequality. And my position right now, as a psychologist and therapist, is that I don't believe that services are centered around the needs of all marginalized groups, particularly people of color. I think it's about time that we take our own mental health into our own hands and basically do for ourselves what services are not able to do for us.
Absolutely. I think going from there, that seems to lead into this question about, well, what do we do as people of color inside of this system when the practitioners don't look like us, when we have this divide between the practitioner and patient, and we know that there aren't enough doctors of color working on wards and there aren't enough therapists of color. I personally refuse to speak to white therapists at this point because it's been so traumatic for me whenever I have. So should we talk a bit about the importance of practitioners who look like us? Obviously, we've got 2 right here. And I'd like to ask you, Dr. McInnis, about African psychology and African-centered approaches to well-being. So how do we fill this gap that's left once we move outside of a white version of healthcare, and how we look back to our own ways of understanding? So when you've said that the curriculum doesn't cover theorists of color, what do we fill the gap that leaves from when we stop talking about Freud?
So that's a really good question. To say that if we don't look towards, you know, Freud, Jung, Aaron Beck's work with CBT, if we don't have that, well, what are we going to do? You just can't be anti everything. But what often people are not talked about is that there is a field of African psychology. There is wisdom looking back to the ancient Egyptians and the healing modalities that were used there. There's even wisdom looking back to to Ghana and West Africa and the culture there. You've got the Adinkra symbols, where you've got different symbols that represent wisdom that are from the Aiken communities. We can use some of those concepts in our healing. So when it comes to, well, what can we do to get the black community involved in mental health care, the emotional emancipation circles that have been running, they've been about not waiting until we get sick, until we then do something to try and repair us. It's about how do we give ourselves emotional wellness skills in the first place, that when these traumas happen, they can bounce off us rather than to go further in because there's already a crack from historical traumas. And the emotional emancipation circles, they aren't stigmatising people. It's not that you've got to be ill and then come. It's about this is how you can just boost your wellness, boost your resilience, and develop emotional wellness skills so that you can become the best version of yourself you can be. But I think a lot of it starts off with knowing who you really are. And knowing who you really are, some of it is about from your families, getting the stories of your ancestors and their stories of strength. How did they get to this country? What did they come to this country for? What's the stories, not of the stories of how bad were they left with, but what was the goodness that there was there? What were their dreams and their ambitions that they came here for? So you're about knowing your own personal history, but also knowing black history. And black history, I'm not talking about just about Martin Luther King Jr. and just the ones that they trot out every year. I'm talking about the stories that are hidden from us, the stories that on the emotional emancipation circles, that we explore, but also kind of, as I said, going back to the ancient Egyptians that were black people and looking about their histories and their culture and their wellness and the systems that they had, such as following Mayat, and the cultural systems that brought about wellness for them and how we can replicate it in the here and now for us.
Yeah, so thinking about our histories before whiteness interrupted, as opposed to like our histories just coming from a place of trauma and navigating it from there.
Yeah, the trajectory that we would have been on if enslavement and colonisation hadn't interrupted us. Because for those of you who've seen Black Panther and the Wakanda, Wakanda is what we had, and Wakanda is what we can have in the future. If we don't just try and ape and mimic our oppressors, if we try and be the best versions of ourselves that we can be.
Wonderful. You finished writing?
Yes. Thank you. It's such a massive question, such a massive question. I don't know whether we can do it justice in a day or a week or a year even. But there's a few things that strike me as being quite important. The first thing that I want to say is that whiteness comes in all colors. And simply because your therapist or your psychologist is black or brown doesn't mean that his epistemology and his ideas are not going to be white. Certainly, I've spoken with people of color who have had therapists who have been black and brown and have done equally, equal damage, if not worse damage, because there's also the sense of betrayal that you should get it. Why are you dishing that stuff to me? So that's one thing. I tend to be a bit more cautious around binaries, construction around, Freud and whiteness and Africa and the beauty of what we were prior the encounter with the white man, so to speak. Because I think we are in danger of throwing, first of all, throwing the baby with the bathwater. I think that there's a lot that we can gain from, different worldview and different way of conceptualizing relationships and relationship with nature and with the world. And actually, when you go to the core of those ideas, so I'm thinking, for instance, in terms of psychoanalysis, actually, there's a large overlap with a lot of African ideas as well, but the way that we have kind of set them as polar opposite, I think sometimes is not helpful. I understand that the history of psychoanalysis is quite problematic. Freud is a problematic figure, but I would not just throw it completely, because I think it does offer some very important tools in terms of how we understand relational processes that are not available within other Western models. I think that there's something about how we become complicit in our own suffering and in our own trauma and in the cycles of violence that can reproduce wound intergenerationally. One of the finding of my thesis, which is on racial trauma, is that actually we don't have those conversations. By and large, parents of color black parents, who are the people that I spend the most time talking to, don't speak to their children about race, around racism, because they carry the wound, and perhaps at some level there is the belief that we are going to protect our children if we avoid this difficult conversation. But what we found is that if we do not have this conversation, the children are not really equipped to deal with the stuff when they start to experience racism. And in my experience, it starts pretty early, by 5, 6, certainly by 10. Most black children would have had an encounter with racism, and they're not able to articulate their experience. So then what they do is they internalize, they think there's something wrong with them. So then the kind of the vicious cycle continues. So I think we need to take some responsibility for healing ourselves. So I always come back to that. And finally, I think something that we need to bear in mind is the individualism of those discourses that we keep having. We can be resilient and we can work on ourselves, but the structure are really damaging. And without addressing the violence and the trauma that is inflicted routinely to marginalized people, we are essentially mopping the floor while the tap is still running open. So there's something about doing both, and again, not setting those two agendas or those two practices as being in opposition, but actually doing them together.
I'm not sure how I'm supposed to follow from that, but I'll try. I really agree with what you were saying earlier about, just because the therapist or the doctor is black does not mean that they're going to empathize or understand what people are going through, and actually sometimes they can even make it worse. To give you an example, one of the people I work with, she's a refugee from Somalia. She went to see her doctor, and she's a Muslim, and her doctor happened to be Muslim as well. So she was, describing to him that actually, she's suffering from depression and so on and so forth. And he basically said to her, well, if your faith was strong enough, you wouldn't be suffering from depression. Now, she stopped accessing support. She stopped talking about her feelings and her emotions, and it basically became worse. And that's just one example I could give you. And I think there's already so much stigma attached to mental health. Many people I work with, say to me that actually mental health doesn't exist in our language, and they feel like they didn't have mental health problems until they came to the UK. And that's because of the asylum system. I mean, the system itself is designed to cause mental health problems before they even meet any staff member. And that just gets compounded upon, and it just becomes worse, basically. So I think what's really important is actually saying, do people really understand what they're supposed to do, what their job is? Don't be coming with your own kind of, assumptions and judgments on people, because that really isolates the community, and then they don't seek help.
I think I've absolutely had an experience similar to that. Well, this was with a white therapist, but where they were reading their own understandings of, or trying to read their understandings of how a black person should feel, and then got it completely wrong and had me typecast as a different kind of black person to the one that I am. And it's like the fact that they weren't even able to ask, but they were, asking me nonsense like, oh, is your father part of your life and stuff, and it's just, that old chestnut, and oh, you're West Indian from what island, and did you know your grandparents, just a real nasty stuff. But I think I've got a question that I think maybe we'll have some different opinions about this, because we've all mentioned about POC not necessarily talking about mental health within our own communities. And also you just brought up that people coming here are finding like part of the issue of having poor mental health as being a person in a majority white space like the UK. Like that to me says something about the diaspora and something about like the traumas of living in this space. Almost suggests that in a majority black country, or a space where you were not a minority and not having to open up about the feeling of difference being Muslim over here or being black over here to your therapist, that there would maybe be a slightly different understanding of mental health in a space where you were not this minority. So I wanted to ask if you felt that that was an accurate read on that, or whether you thought that part of the reason why POC here are having difficulties in talking about mental health is partially diaspora-based. And I'm thinking about your work on African-centered approaches to wellness, and this idea that you were talking about in terms of not thinking of thinking about the preparation before damage and having that discussion about mental health before the cracks start to show. Like, do you have any insights on that?
Well, there's a few things that come to mind with what you're mentioning, and I think it relates a little bit back to what the panellists have said about if you are going to be trying to get more black people into the mental health system as therapists and professionals rather than as service users, how are we going to make them different from the white people who are there? Because otherwise we'll just have black people who are just doing the same as white people but with a different coloured face. So how they're going to make a difference? And to me, it's about you're going to make sure that that black person is a woke black person or conscious, as they say, so that they are actually tuned in to the beauty of their blackness as opposed to perpetuating further damage. But it also makes me think to say that there still will be differences. So there will be sometimes differences between me and the client that I may be working with in terms of maybe from a different class, that we maybe with a different gender, that our experiences may have been very different in areas. And I think you're always going to get that between a therapist and a client. But to me, it's about what you do about that and how you can cover that ground and build a solid enough relationship so that you can then explore that and you can then get onto that other person's page. I don't think you're ever going to really find a perfect fit. It's going to be what is good enough. And I think sometimes what we're finding is that black people who do get into systems, they try and mimic white people to try and get advancement within those systems. And then that's when they become even more damaging to black people, because you go to them thinking that they can help, but instead they're just another form of barrier. Please remind me of the question that you asked.
So I was asking about this understanding that we have that POC within their communities don't talk about mental health.
But
like what you've said about, looking at different African approaches to holistic wellness sort of suggests that they do, and that we do have, because there's that narrative that we don't talk about it and that's part of the problem, but this is the first time we've approached
I wonder whether for black people it's where we go to talk about it.
That's right.
So I wonder whether it's where we go to talk about it is we go to the barber shop, or we go to the hairdressers, or we go to the church, or we go to the market, That may be within this culture where we go and we talk about, or it may even be funerals or weddings when you get together as black people and your families get together. That's where you can actually talk about your issues, and that's where the healing takes place. But I'm wondering whether back in Africa or back in the Caribbean, there were people that people went to, and there would be obia men and obia women. Right. And for those who are not familiar with that culture, they're people who would be wise that you would go to, who would actually help you talk about your problems and that you would talk to. So there were informal counsellors. Sometimes there were it would be elders in the family, or the village would come together. And if a child of the village did something wrong, you wouldn't necessarily talk to that child. You'd get the village together and you'd speak to where did the village go wrong and what we did to help that child. So you'd even maybe talk to the grandparents, or you'd talk to the Sunday school teacher or the religious leader and say that what can we do to support that person. So there was a system looking at the person as being good, but something's gone wrong. Whereas what I'm wondering is whether what we often encounter in this country is that black people are often seen as bad, as trouble causers, as inferior, as backwards, as trying to be thieves, that type of thing. So that when we actually do approach services, sometimes they're not looking for the goodness in us. They're actually seeing us as something to be feared, and they're not going the extra mile to even help us.
So is that something that you could possibly put down to, like, something diaspora related, that the idea that we've lost something there, the idea that, because I know for myself when I started talking about mental health in and amongst my family, there was definitely this feeling of, oh, well, look what your grandparents went through when they came here, that's real strife that maybe wouldn't have.
I think there's something going on in terms of kind of like, if you go back even through to the slave trade, it was, in our enslavement as black people, it was all about keeping the body going, Nobody was interested in our minds, And even after, the tortures of slavery happened, there was nothing put together to say that, oh, what can we do to help repair people getting over the trauma? It was just get on with it. And I think that's been passed down from generation to generation of just get on with it, and just try and shut away any of the bad experiences and just kind of like, just keep, trotting through. But the problem is that there's only so much you can take, and I think what happens to a lot of black people is we get battle weary. Picking back on what you were saying, Guilaine, about, from the age of 5, children having microaggressions and macroaggressions, from sometimes in multiple settings, when they're at school, when they're maybe at their after-school clubs, at their hobbies, they're getting it in various settings, and if when they go home, parents don't even acknowledge the trauma that they're going through, but just say, oh, that's what it's like, and get on with it, There isn't really the space for healing. So I'm now coming around to saying that to some extent there could be something in what you're saying in terms of a culture has developed where we will have sympathy for somebody with a broken leg, but if somebody's mind is fractured because of what they've been through, there isn't that sort of sympathy within the culture, because it has been about just getting on with the work and just getting there. And the number of black professional people that are breaking down in various ways and struggling to stay in these environments, it's just it's the untold story. It really is what's affecting us.
Great. So thank you.
I'm always wary when people start to talk about stigma in communities of color. Not that I don't want to deny that it exists. I think that stigma is a fact, and I think it exists within all communities. I don't know whether we have sufficient evidence to say that there is more stigma within black and brown communities. But what I do know is that this is often used as a discourse within mental health services to say, oh, well, they're not accepting services because of stigma, or we can't reach them because of stigma, or, there's not enough black people training as psychologists because of stigma. So there's a lot of myth around that, which I think are used to certainly function to then further over people of color, and then to locate the problem in us. So that is to me something that needs addressing. I think when we're talking about stigma, we need to think about the history of psychology, where it comes from, where there is this intergenerational fear and suspicion towards clinical psychology. I've spoken to people in the street, young black men who have told me, why do you want me to go to psychology? Isn't it the same people who used to think that we were inhuman? Do you think this stuff just disappear? People know that. They hold it in mind. So I think it is, the onus is on services to prove that they've moved on. It's not people who have been damaged, through centuries, to actually show trust. I don't think that's the way that as human beings we function. And when we think about intersectionality, you're talking with people who are already multiply marginalized by race, often by social class, and a large people of color, large proportion of people of color have also disabilities, and all those things kind of add up. And then you're saying to people, oh, come, I'm going to give you another label as mad. And actually, we're not going to make space to discuss the sociopolitical context, the historical context. And then you think that people are children. They're just going to accept that, not understanding what that is going to mean in real term in their life. The last thing that I want to raise is around the issue of religion, because I do think that there is a very important conversation to be had around how we make space within services for people who are religious and for people who hold different explanatory models when it comes to their mental health. It is absolutely valid, if this is how you make sense of the world, to believe that the reason that I'm unwell is because of genies, is because of demons or whatever you. It's not our job as mental health professionals or to say, well, actually, this is primitive, because that's, again, the reproduction of whiteness and colonialism. At the same time, I don't believe that it is a professional remit to be imposing his own belief system on a patient. So in the case of the doctor, it's obviously out of order for him to be saying to a patient that she needs to pray harder. At the same time, if the patient had come and say, hey, I'm struggling because I have this religious or this spiritual crisis, we need to be able to engage with that. That is our job too.
Great. Again, I don't know how to spell to that. Stop making it hard for me. I think mostly with the groups that I work with, asylum seekers and refugees, is really a lack of awareness of mental health. People come from cultures where if you're seen to have a mental health problem, you'd be locked up, basically, and isolated from the rest of the community. So coming to a new country, starting from scratch, you've come from a war zone, and having to ask for support is always a barrier for people. And you talked about intersectionality, there's language barriers and so on. So one of the things that we do at my work, we do something called community conversations, where we work with 12 people at a time for 8 sessions, and we raise awareness about mental health and well-being using the arts. So it's a very kind of community development approach. And at the beginning, every single time, everyone's like, we don't want to talk about this. This is like, we don't know much about it, and there's that sense of fear, but actually, so many people need help and support. And I remember one person in particular. I've known her for a couple of years through different things, and I said to her, do you want to come and join this community conversation? People find it, useful, beneficial, and also the kind of artwork that's created gets exhibited, and members of the public find out about what asylum seekers and refugees are going through in the UK. And she said, yeah, it sounds good. I'm up for it. Where do you work? And I said, I work, in George Square in Glasgow. And she's like, okay, what's the name of your organization? And I said, it's the Mental Health Foundation. And she just looked at me. She goes, no, I'm not coming. And I was like, why? And she's like, I'm not mental. Right? And I was like, actually, okay, where do we start? So it's actually having to break that down. And as I said earlier, because mental health is seen like as a horrible thing where you get locked up and you're taken away from your family, the rest of the community is going to judge you, no one's going to talk to you anymore. So it's trying to break those barriers down. And it's amazing to see the progress that people make, but it does take a lot of work. But one of the things I'm very passionate about is involving people with lived experience to work with us, to move together, because there's no one who understands how it feels like to be an asylum seeker and refugee as much as asylum seekers and refugees. So we have people who work with us. We have volunteers as well, because asylum seekers are not allowed to work. So it's amazing to see that the kind of power of the peer element of it. We've done a peer research project where we trained 2 asylum seekers to go out into the community and to just kind of dispel those myths that you were talking about. So I think there is a lot of awareness that needs to be, shared, I guess, and acknowledged.
And I think there's something very important in terms of validating the fear. The fear is here for a reason, because there's a lot of violence that is being done to people within services. So it's no good telling people, trust us. Let's think differently about how we conceptualize what it means to be psychologically well, or having no mental health problems, so to speak. But the bottom line is that, you go on certain wards, and it's all black people there. You look at people who are being over-medicated. Hey, it's black people. You look at people being, deprived of their liberty, and the way that people get into the system is black people. So you have that in the background. So as long as we have that in the background, what we talk about is only going to hit barriers. People are going to say, yeah, you talk a good game, but actually, open me this door, and they're going to see that, and they're going to say, yeah, thank you very much, I don't want none of that.
I'll just take this moment to ask if anyone in the audience has a question. Yeah, the roving mics.
So I don't listen to all the time, but I just want to ask what role you think that class has in this discussion. For me, we were talking about how kids don't have that conversation around mental health. And if I think of my mum, she worked 2 parts, 2 jobs, came home and definitely my brothers. Even at the time, I think for her, that what you're saying about people just get on with it. I think a lot of times, parents who are immigrants, if I work hard enough, my kids aren't going to have to go through this. And then also, both my parents are professionals. It's how to use language. I went to, I was in English school and stuff, and even my parents in English, I don't even know how to articulate to them how we're taught stuff about mental health in Britain. And I think a lot, same levels of things like asylum seekers, and where children go through the British school system, their ability to talk to their parents and share that trauma is obviously like, it kind of separates more and more. And the other thing I was asking was about mental health professionals and stuff. Like the reason I think like classes is such an important role in that is because how can you have that shared experience? Like if you're someone whose parents are professionals, like for example, you go to private school, you go to university, your experience is so different from being a working class person. And obviously we talk about like structural racism and stuff and how that affects different people from different economic classes. So yeah, I just wanted to know what you guys thought about that and the role that that plays in the discussion around health.
Yeah, I just wanted to like touch on that before I open up to the panelists. What you've just said about the differences between class and being able to articulate yourself in these spaces, I think is really important, especially when we examine the room that we have here today. Like there is an element of like privilege to us being able to occupy this space and thinking about how we reckon with that that class thing as POC as well, the intersections in there, what we can do to expand those understandings of labour and trauma to people in a less fortunate position. Because, I mean, I think about this in terms of, this is something that myself, in this book I've edited, myself and my co-editor, Dr. Samara Linton, who's like now a medic, a junior medic. So she, we've both discussed the difference in when we go to talk about our mental health to a doctor, for instance. So I've thought, we both talked about how the difference between like ourselves and our working class parents trying to trying to get the help that we need in just any medical context. So myself, I've noticed that my dad and I have the same doctor, and I knew that whenever I went in there, I had to unveil my problems in a very specific way. Like I had to navigate that space between being just ill enough to get what I need, but also articulate enough to make them understand that I needed it. And it was sort of something I was really conscious of my privilege in that moment as someone who is able to like occupy spaces like these and articulate myself in that way. And then I saw the difference between my dad trying to get treatment for something and being turned away again and again and again, and us, like me just eventually being like, we need to change doctor because this person is racist and they're not taking you seriously and they're only taking me seriously because I go in there and code switch to hell, like it's ridiculous. And something that Samara has then said is that when someone that she knows close to her is trying to get help from a doctor, she sort of gives them the key words that they need to say, like the key words that she knows because she's experienced the other side of that patient-practitioner divide, and says, okay, well, if you say this, this, and this, that's what will make them pay attention. And that's a ridiculous thing that we have to do, and like a deep problem with this system. So one of the ways that we tried to navigate that with the book is that we've tried very hard not to touch the way that people, like, which is a difficult job as an editor, not to touch the way people have chosen to articulate themselves too much. We've had, when we edited certain pieces and we're like taking out certain mistakes, we'd show it to the author and they'd be like, actually, can you put them back? Because that's how I want it to look. And we just thought that that's a really radical way to look at this, like to not, because if we clean it up to make it more palatable or accessible to a white academia, then like who is it for? And that's really something that is difficult to navigate in this space and time, where the system is how it is, that the fact that you need, in order to get the help you need, you have to speak in a certain way, and that's a real problem and a slow change, because like when you're talking to doctors who don't look like you, and again, like not all skin folk are kinfolk, and if a doctor does look like you, that doesn't mean anything necessarily, does it? So it's she was talking about how she is on a ward right now, on a psychiatric ward, and all of her patients are black and brown, and most of the doctors are white, and that like for them there is this element of distance, and she heard like doctors like making fun or making light of, you know, you're thinking these are the people we have to talk to understand us in order to get the help that we need and deserve, and they just don't get it, and they're going to be picking apart like what we do, and the class aspect of that is just so important, and it seems so vast. like, what do we do until we start getting representatives from different classes who are able to code switch in that way and understand what you need?
Yeah, well, the class issue, it makes you think of a number of things, because I suppose the way I see it is with these things, it's never one or the other. People can be middle class, can be upper class as black people, and they're still experiencing racism. So class is not a kind of like a way of protecting yourself from the experiences of white supremacy. But what can happen is that having access to money and not being in poverty can help give you avenues to navigate the system of white supremacy. So for some people, that, you know, if you are in a kind of like a in a sink council estate somewhere and you're experiencing a lot of oppression, you know, if you have access to money, you may be able to move yourself out of there. If you have access to money, you may be able to have a better diet. If your child is experiencing racism and the system of white supremacy at school, and you've got access to money, you may be able to get them to a private school to help navigate it. But when they go to that private school, they will still get it there as well. So sometimes it does having access to certain ways of thinking and having access to money can help you, but it's still limited. I think the system of white supremacy is still it's so pervasive that it's affecting black people and brown people of multiple classes. So it still comes back to the issue, you know, for us, what are we going to do about the system of white supremacy and making ourselves resilient enough to say that when we do come and get hit by it, you know, we can bounce back, or we can create our own system to say that we don't have to rely on our oppressors to try and feed us, to try and clothe us, to try and educate us, that we've got another space that we've put together. And the other point that I was going to make about that is that the classism that often goes on within black communities, sometimes it's shadeism or colorism that's going on. So it's about what particular hue of blackness you've got, or hue of brownness that you've got. And that needs to be taken into account to say that people can internalise the system of white supremacy so much that they actually don't value other black people, or they don't value other black people of a particular shade because they've internalised it that much. So there's a lot of work to be done within the black community to get us woke, as we say, or up to speed, that when we are then serving our fellow black people, that we're serving them from a good place, and that we're just not replicating the oppression with a different coloured face.
Amal? Yeah.
Sure. I think in particular your question around kind of young people with, you know, who are refugees and then having to speak to their families, I think it can be such a big problem. And again, there's so many barriers in that, because I feel like sometimes when, you know, kids tell their parents that, you know, I feel down, or I've got mental health problems and so on, sometimes families are like, no, just do this particular thing, you'll be fine. You know, if you pray enough, you'll be fine. If you do this, if you're good to your sisters or brothers, you'll be fine, you know. And it's actually saying, no, you need to validate, you know, what people are going through. If you know, children have experienced a lot of trauma from where they've come from. And to give an example, I've worked recently with a group of Syrian refugees, and they've found it really hard to integrate with other children just because of the trauma, the level of trauma that they've gone through. But they just don't feel confident enough to speak about it, because at home, you know, that's something that's not common. It's not supported enough. I think it's because of just the kind of culture. Of course, not everyone's like that. There are other places that people can open up and families are supportive. And I think also when it comes to young people, they have obviously role models, which are usually celebrities. And I think slowly now we're seeing celebrities speaking up about mental health. Like I think that Stormzy was really vocal about it. And I think there's not enough education in schools. And I'm not just talking about people of color. I think, you know, across the board, you know, having done some work in schools, I always hear teachers saying there's not enough available for kids to access support and to access mental health services. But I think we need more kind of community leaders and people that other kids can relate to as well, and I guess people of color can relate to.
Yeah, I mean, even just then, like when we're talking about therapy and so on, that's like a like a massive class thing there. Like not everyone can afford therapy and not everyone can afford spaces like this. So in terms of integrating it in our education system, that seems incredibly valuable, because I think also the way that we've talked about therapy on this panel is slightly different to a lot of the way that some people, I'm thinking particularly of maybe in terms of a class or a POC, both kind of way. Like, I mean, a lot of people think of therapy as a means to an end, as opposed to, you know, something that is a wellness, like counselling as like something like as an ongoing part. Like, so for instance, my mom was saying that, like, you know, was interested in going to therapy as in, you know, to talk about our stuff. And then she said, like, I obviously get counselling, and she'll be like, so when do you think you can stop that? When will you be better? And I don't think that that's not the way I think about counselling. I think of counselling as something that, especially when you're navigating this world as a person of colour and you're constantly being piled on, this can be like a helpful way to deconstruct some of that damage. And it's something like, the damage isn't going to go away. It's something that I think of as like as necessary as going to the doctor or dentist. Like, it's just you're just taking care of another part of yourself. But of course, when I used to think about counselling before I got it, I thought of it as something that only like rich white Americans did. And you know, because that's what you see, isn't it? Like when you're watching, you go see a shrink, and I don't have money for a shrink. I still don't. So you know, that it's that kind of, it's even the way we think about it is conditioned by class. You know, because not everyone has that money in their pocket to keep going to see a counsellor.
Can I just add to that as well? But I think the answer sometimes is not always going to see a therapist. And I hear that a lot, because people say, you know, we just want to be in an environment where we can talk about what we're going through with people who understand what we're going through. So again, it's all about that kind of peer support element. And when we do these sessions and then they come to an end, sometimes I see them at other events or on the street, and they're saying, when are you going to run the community conversations again? Because we felt so much better, but now we've gone back to how we used to feel. Because if you're seeking asylum, there's no time limit of when you're going to get that piece of paper to say you can stay in the country. So you're constantly worrying about the postman coming to knock out your door. And I know someone who's very close to me. She's one of my very close friends, and she's been seeking asylum for 24 years. Imagine not being able to work or go to university for 24 years. She came when she was 13, and just 3 weeks ago she received the letter. But now she's faced with a whole other set of issues, because the job center are expecting her to work. She needs to get a house, and you know, and she's like, but I've not been able to work. So it's having things in place for people to maybe is to see a therapist, but then what happens after that? You know, then people are just left with nothing to go back to if they're, you know, going through that system.
I think we have to be careful. And I say that someone earning a living out of doing therapy, but I think that there is a danger of commodification, of the commodification of pain, of distress, and using capitalism as a way to basically put a plaster on the wounds of capitalism. So it doesn't really strike me as something that makes a lot of a lot of sense. There is something about social class, to try to go back to the point. Class doesn't sit in a vacuum. Of course, class is racialized, class is gendered, but there is something very important about the culture. And when you were asking the question, I was thinking about the cultural capital that it takes to be a good client, to be a client that is in distress enough to get therapy, but not too distressed to actually risk getting detained or getting a treatment that is perhaps a lot more violent. And this kind of capital, as we've said, is in the language, is in the demeanor that you can see it, is in the way that we speak, because by and large therapy is scattered around whiter, more middle class, more cis, more heterosexual people. So if you deviate from this norm, you are going to hit more barriers in terms of being seen within services. I think there's something quite fundamental about poverty, and poverty being, to me, a form of trauma that needs to be said and to be addressed. And what the evidence, going back to the evidence, what the evidence show again and again is people who do the best or the most in therapy tend to be the people who have the most social support. Mm-hmm. So they tend to be the people who are perhaps more resilient socially, so perhaps less intersectionally vulnerable. They tend to be the people who do the best. So in that case, if the evidence tends to say, hey, actually, if you fix what goes on around people, they don't necessarily need therapy, maybe we need to look that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. I know there were a few more questions. Yes?
Thanks. I have two questions. The first one was that I think a lot of the times on these panels, you guys all discussing really wonderful work that you've done, the concepts, and just the research that you've done and what you've worked with. I think sometimes when we come here, we ask for solutions, and a lot of the time, a structural overhaul of the whole race system is the only answer. You don't have enough tools to looking for, even though that's one clinician is looking. So I wanted to ask, kind of along the lines of what you were talking about, Ree, with Dr. Smarrington, when she was saying that because she's come from both sides, both being a practitioner and a patient, she can kind of equip people with certain tactics or kind of practical things to navigate the system, given all of the work and research. I wanted to ask each of you if you could give a piece of advice as young people of colour, predominantly in this room, but people of colour, black people especially. What would be your kind of small practical pieces of advice to navigate the system of whiteness within the class? So that was my first question, and the second one is very down there. These now are really practical. And also one thing that I think came up as well is that within mental health practices in the UK, a lot of the time when we speak from a perspective of race, class, gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth, it's completely based on lived experiences, and because we live in the white world, we live in the UK, and the kind of mainstream lived experience doesn't reflect kind of our bodies, our lives. How do we incorporate a sense of being taken seriously when we talk from a personal perspective? So yeah, those are the questions. Thank you.
Okay, the second one was about how within mental health practices in the UK, our mainstream lived experiences don't necessarily reflect the ones. Sorry, mainstream lived experiences don't necessarily reflect ours. So how do we talk about it?
Okay. So if I take the first part of the question, which was if there was one tip that you could give to kind of like help navigate the system. Well, if it was as simple as that, we wouldn't all be here.
Yeah.
But if we could just try and say that, you know, one thing that may help. So I think within the black community, it's the materialism, hyper-materialism. So, and you know, there's buying into the capitalist system, but buying into the system when we can least afford it. So you'll have black people who will say, I can't afford therapy, but they've got the latest trainers and the latest designer fashion label of jeans and stuff like that, because our priority is looking good rather than trying to make our minds good. Yeah. So one of the things is about seeing if you can kind of like. I'm not saying that if you can afford these things that you don't get it, but we're often doing it when we can't afford it, and that is then what's putting us into poverty, yeah? Because we're not thinking out the long term and about things that will benefit our own community, because we're passing that money around somebody else's community rather than the things that may benefit our own community. And what was really good is when I think it was Jesse earlier on said about the black spaces that we could go to for lunch, that we could put money back into that community rather than necessarily into somebody else's community. So, and linked with that is about how we can be producers rather than just consumers. Just the self-value that comes from knowing that you can produce something rather than that you always have to go to somebody else for help. And that's just leading me into the thoughts about how do we fortify the community with wellness, yeah? so that we've got systems that work for us, that they're not as likely to break down. So those systems are things like, how do we, incorporate things like dance into our community, drumming, music, because we've all had times when we felt low about something, but then you've gone out and listened to a piece of music and it raises your spirits. It raises your chakras, it kind of like vibrates your chakras at different levels. So how do we put that into our community as some of our wellness practices that we're doing regularly, rather than it being something, say that, well, we're going out clubbing as if it's, as if it's something that we shouldn't be doing, or that it's something that we just do occasionally. We need to put those things that can help us release the best of us spiritually into what we're doing on a day-to-day basis, that we can have some sort of resilience to the pressures that we face, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly. And it just made me think of a point what one of the other panellists said earlier on, to say that how sometimes family members can say that, you're not experiencing much these days because of what our ancestors have experienced. But sometimes the covert and hidden and subsidious nature of the system of white supremacy can be very damaging nowadays, particularly to our young people. And to me, another tip may be about, if as a community we actually realise what's going on, that we can be sympathetic and empathetic when our young people are coming to us and saying they feel low and that they feel down, because they genuinely are having those feelings, and capitalism sometimes contributes to it, because a child can feel inferior because they don't have the latest type of phone, or they don't have the latest type of trainers that other people are wearing. But we need to create a system to say that, well, goodness isn't just based on those material items. You can be good in other ways. And if we can start selling that to our young people and selling that to ourselves at multiple ages, I think that will help us to almost like inoculate ourselves from the worst of the system of white supremacy, which is designed to make us sick and often does make us sick. I'll leave it at that.
So, for me, I think, as someone who's still trying to figure that out, I'd say that, when you were there, as I had some, I was not doing great in my last couple of years of uni, but I'm doing a lot better now. I think the main thing that I've been able to do is cultivate this incredible support system. And I think sometimes I'm lucky enough that the discussion about how POC don't talk about mental health just doesn't apply to me. All of the black women I surround myself with and people I surround myself with are very aware of themselves and very aware of their own mental health, and constantly checking each other and constantly talking to each other about when we feel low and having understandings of each other. And we're just a very warm and good community. And sometimes when you're living in a white space like Edinburgh, those communities aren't physically around you. So when I first started at Edinburgh, I was the only black person in town. So, and now it's a little different. Looking at a room like this would not have been possible when I first started here. And I think valuing those communities and finding them where you can, whether that's digitally or in real life. I think people, obviously this is my PhD area, so I'm really keen on hyping digital black communities and digital communities of colour. I think that in the absence of physical connectivity, that's something that's incredibly valid. And I have plenty of friends that I'm there for that I can't be there for physically because we live in different countries, but we've got each other and we know that we're doing the same thing and feeling the same things, and that's been incredibly affirming for me. I think that's in terms of that mainstreamed lived experience that we feel that doesn't apply to us. The point is finding those communities where your lived experience is the norm is so important. I rarely think about white people and white problems and so on. I mean, for me right now, my lived experience is the main experience, and I think that a lot of us have some way to get till we're there, because of the areas that we're in and so on. So if you can reach that point where your experience as a black woman, or as, you know, like, well, I'm talking about black women because I'm a black woman, but, you know, where your experience in all your intersections is the people you're surrounded with and they all understand you, that is so much less of an isolating experience for you, and it will really teach you how to do those things, I think.
Okay, so before I get into that one thing that you wanted, I think it's important to remember that there's no distinction between doctors and people who use services. This kind of binary construction are not helpful. They kind of feed alienation and kind of them and us thinking. There's plenty of evidence for people who are interested that shows that actually people who work in mental health services, they are more prone to mental health problems. So the distinction is really a fallacy that is really damaging. That's the one thing. That you wanted one thing, I'm going to give you three, right? So you get two free. You get two free. And that's evidence. That's based on the evidence, and I spend a lot of time reviewing the evidence for my thesis, so I know this stuff a little well. The first thing is that people who have higher self-esteem tend to fare better within white structures. They bounce more quickly when they experience racial trauma or racism. So working on your self-esteem is not time wasted. The second thing is those who tend to have a stronger racial identity, which is a massive problem for second and third generation migrant, where you don't feel that you belong quite neatly within the culture of your ancestry and within the mainstream society at large. That is a risk factor. So if you can identify more strongly with the culture of your parents or your grandparents or your ancestry, this is a protective factor. And the last thing around what seems to be helping is organizing, and that is usually termed around active coping style or strategy, which can be a little bit counterintuitive because people might think, well, actually it's too demanding for your time, emotionally, cognitively, energy-wise, don't do anything. But what the evidence suggests is that people who don't do anything fare worse. Yeah, and that is that's something that challenges. Then people who actually challenge with support. So I would say those three things. The last thing that I would say perhaps is around how I feel very conflicted, and I'm a black feminist, but nonetheless there is, I think, a narrative around we get to a point where perhaps we've done a therapy, we've done our work toward on ourselves, and then that's it, we heal. Or we recovered. I don't know that is real at all. I think that as long as we live within a violent structure, within structure that other us and marginalize us and treat us violently, I guess we're always going to have to do this work. So this work is not something that you do for 6 months with a therapist. If you're lucky enough to have a good therapist, which I am. Hey. If you're lucky enough to have support and to learn some tools and some strategy to navigate this environment, then you need to understand that this stuff is for life. You are always going to have to be cautious about how you're not going to let the structure get inside of you too much, because some of it is going to get inside of you. And something around how we resist and how we try to survive, I think we have to be cautious not to put a hierarchy around, this is good resistance and this is bad resistance, because actually if there was a recipe, again, as you say, we wouldn't be here. I think we do the best we can. And sometimes it means looking good, hey? Because actually it is a way to resist. So, kids have their trainers because it's part of how they identify, and they can also feel that they are part of something. Let's not throw the trainers. Let's think about why do kids want to hold on to their trainers. But as you said, Erica, give them also the story that you are more than your trainers. Your trainers are important. I want you to do too, right? But actually, you're not all. You're more than your trainers.
Yes, yeah, I like that. Very nice.
I think for me, the kind of main tip is speaking up. You know, it's not always easy, and there's other ways to use it as well. I started the Gaza Girls campaign when I was 15 years old. You know, I took on the Home Office. I was like, bring it on. My mom's like, we just got our papers and you want, okay. And that's why I'm saying it's not easy. But as a young person, for me, it was, you know, I saw my friend be treated inhumanely. And she wasn't able to speak up for herself. She was detained in a detention center, but I felt like, you know what, I'm going to do it. I don't know what I'm going to achieve here, but I have to speak up for what's right. And I think a lot of the times people experience a lot of human rights violations. They're really being mistreated and oppressed, but they don't have that confidence and that self-esteem to say, actually, this is wrong, and you can't treat me like this. And it takes, of course, a lot of confidence, but also, you know, you guys were saying about having that people in your community who understand you, and the way I like to see it, having your tribe, you know, your people who get you and understand what you're going through. And I think it's really important. And I think a focus on self-care is really crucial. You know, last week we were running a youth group and we were talking about the impact of social media. And I see it as a blessing and a curse, because I feel like, you know, it's great because you can access so much information and everything, but also it can put a lot of people down in terms of many problems. And you have the keyboard gangsters, as I like to call them, who just, you know, say horrible, nasty stuff. And I think it's about keeping safe, you know, and just realizing that the support is out there. It's just about finding it and just having the confidence to say, this is what I need and I have to do it. And change is possible. If anyone knows that, it's me. And again, I'm so passionate about using different ways to raise awareness and to access support. I think arts, you know, singing, dancing, art, and poetry is so powerful, and it really reaches an audience that, you know, maybe we couldn't reach. So
one thing I always want to add after, like, of course, us speaking up and speaking out is so important, but always I want to add after, you know, talking about activism amongst us. Sometimes it's okay not to as well. Yes. Sometimes rest, sometimes sleep, because it's very easy when sometimes there's a line where activism really helps you feel better, where changing the system is like, yes, I'm doing the thing, I'm fixing it, it's going to be good for all of us and me, and then it's very easily crosses over into that line where it makes everything worse for you personally. So like, if that isn't what you want to do, remember that resistance, you know, survival is an act of resistance in itself, and you know, you don't have to be out there on the front lines all the time at cost to your own mental health. Now there's a question. Yes, sorry boss, I know you've been waiting a while.
Hello.
Hello.
I've actually got a question, not from me. So, like you said, parents will talk to the kids about race. My mum doesn't talk about it with me. We said 2 nights ago, I was like talking about this conference, and mum was like, I don't want to talk to you, I'm like, oh, I'm in trouble. So my mum's a nurse in Glasgow, and she's been a nurse for about 15 to 20 years. Don't really pay attention. And she just started talking about how she's feeling a lot of pain, her head's full, I'm getting a paracetamol, and she said, no, let's go on, I want you to tell them something. And she says, the reason I'm ill is because I've been speaking to the nurses, and mum mainly works with nurses from the Asian African background. And she had a chat with them, they're all saying they're not enjoying work, they're all feeling the same head pain, and that is because as nurses of colour, they're feeling oppressed by people from above, they're not feeling equal, and it's really having an effect on them in the house life. Now my mum never speaks to me about race and what I'm getting up to. She supports it when I was in the US, but it's very rare for my mum to talk about these things. So my question is on behalf of my mum, and it's all about how or what can we do to boost the confidence of people of colour staff, nursing staff in our NHS, because that's having an effect on them when they're with their patients, when they're coming home. And I don't usually cry with my mum, but literally sitting at home, I was crying, she was crying, and it kind of made sense why she's coming home ill. She doesn't cook now these days as much. But my question is, what can we do to make sure nurses feel safe in our environment and can actually do their job better, that they're not leaving a place of health and making someone feel better to make themselves unwell. And that hard I speak about mom. A few people think I talk a lot. And now we're talking about mom. And it was just there we were talking now, I feel like, yeah, that just like what she was saying, what you're talking about. And she is unwell, she's half a century old now. And
You can't put it like that, man. Mom's going to fight you.
and she is struggling. And it isn't just in general, it's because of work.
Yeah.
And the people at the top kind of not making them feel welcome. And each time I said, we just don't say anything because we just need to get the work done.
Should we switch it up and... Oh, sorry. Do you want to go? I was going to switch it up and go that way.
No, please go.
No, you really hit on something there, because my mum's, she's a retired nurse. I was a nurse for 30 odd years. And I used to work full time in the NHS myself. And one of the things that I'm going to say, thinking of things from an African-centered perspective, it's not one or the other, yeah, it's the both. We need to do things that pay the bills, yeah, but we also need to remember to do things that spiritually enliven us, things that make us feel joy, make us feel free, and it's about how can we get to a point where we're doing a bit of that. So for me, it went from when I was working full-time to then just working part-time. And part-time, I could do the things that kind of gave me joy, that gave me life, and start off my own business, yeah? Which then got to the stage eventually where it was bringing in an income. And it's about how can we then always start off your own little business or your own doing things in the community to help other people, that you get a sense of joy from that, because there's too many of us where it's, we live to work. It's kind of like, you go to work, you come home, you eat, you sleep, and then you go back to work again, yeah? And you may do a bit of studying in between. Yeah. And that becomes our life. And you fight lots of battles of racism along the way, with people above you, people below you, people at your level, and the people that you're meant to be helping get better as well. So it's kind of like, when we're seeing lots of black people kind of like as users of mental health system, it's not all that they're just being over kind of like diagnosed as having problems. There's a lot of us that are breaking down because the system is quite toxic, and it's designed to be toxic, yeah? There's an industry that is created out of making us sick and then providing the services to try and make us better. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we can do to kind of like, to counter that slightly, is to be doing our own businesses, doing our own things that give us joy, that we can have that coming into our lives, that when people are telling us and weighing us down and saying that we're no good, we know for a fact that there are things that we do that do contribute, that do have a sense of purpose, that do help people, that we can then, go back to our self-esteem, we can then build up our self-esteem. Because sometimes in those toxic spaces, no matter how much self-esteem you get from your upbringing, from your parents, from your family, from your community, the weight of all of this then starts to bring you down, and you need those other things to counter that, to be able to give you that sense of joy. So I don't know if that's of any help to you. Silence.
Well, I'm just going to briefly say that in terms of like a practical way, I think that it's really powerful to hear those experiences from people that we don't tend to think about. We, as Guilaine mentioned earlier, like our doctors are people too. The people we're talking to come with their own biases, come with their own problems, especially when they're also POC navigating the same systems as us. Right. Of course, that's going to take a toll on them too. So I suppose in terms of, here's a cheeky plug, in terms of like practical things that I hope that we've done is in The Colour of Madness, there's a chapter called Blue, and that's where we talk about the institutions that we work through. And we've got like a few lots of narratives from doctors and nurses, on both sides of the institution, the patient, the practitioner. And I think that hearing those narratives, even giving people a space to express those, because it sounds like your mom's just having to deal with that, come home, and then not having a place to unpack that for herself, not having the care that a space also to do that too. And also sometimes after a long day of that, you don't really want to come home and keep talking about it, so it just eats at you, a productive and healthy space where we can hear things like this from people that we don't often hear from is incredibly valuable, and I think we need to make more time and space for that to happen.
And just to build on that, I think we need to start doing that before we break down, because quite often, once you've broken down, you don't have the energy to do any of these wellness things that we're talking about. So we need to go back to what we said about schooling and education. We need to almost build this into the curriculum of what people have from when they're a young person, that when they're older, they're already making sure that they're finding time for what spiritually enlivens them, or even to find what that is, because sometimes, you know, we don't even get to explore what that is, because we're just so much into the consumerism and the capitalist system, to say that we've got to then do what gives us the most money, as opposed to what gives us the most joy and what we're actually good at, which in turn can then come round to then, you know, to give us other rewards and make life fulfilling.
I'm not sure how helpful I'm going to be. I tend to be quite pessimistic as far as structures and systems are concerned, and my starting point is always that all systems are microcosm of the world, so therefore whatever happens outside, unfortunately, is going to happen within any system. So there's something about coming to terms with the violence that cannot but be dished within system and towards certain bodies. But one thing that I do know for sure is that organizations and institutions who tend to deal with trauma tend to be more toxic. So there is something about maybe unprocessed trauma that can kind of cause injury to the most vulnerable within those structures, and they tend to be people of color, which take me back to a point that I wanted to go back to around older generation, oftentimes thinking that they had a tougher time, and actually they were not distressed, and actually they cope better with it. Well, the reason why so many of us are distressed is bloody because they were not distressed. And therefore the stuff has been passed down for us to be doing the distressing.
Very good point. Yeah. I think a really good point. Sorry, just one last response. We've got to...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
One thing I've been thinking quite a lot about is this sense of people of color have to overperform, and you know, you have to prove yourself, because you know you're lucky to be in this country and so on and whatever. And I think I can really relate to what you were saying, because my mother, she's a community worker, and recently she's been really kind of saying the same things your mom was mentioning. And I think the most important part of that is your mom recognizing that that's what she's going through. That's the first step. And then after that, it's actually saying, okay, what can we do about this? And I guess this is where you can help with that. And so I had a chat with her, and I was like, okay, I understand and everything like that. And we talked about what's at her work that she could do, and so she's talking about cutting hours and so on. But then I said, you know what? How about I take you away from Glasgow? And we went to the Highlands for a few days. And honestly, the difference that it made, being around nature, being away from the city and the busy life, and being away from her phone. She's always on WhatsApp. She always complains that me and my sister are on the phone, but actually she's the worst one. So I think it's just about recognizing that and actually finding ways to kind of de-stress and feel better, I guess. And it can be really simple sometimes. It doesn't have to be something really big. So I hope that helps.
Okay. So thank you so much for all of your questions. That's all we have time for. So can you join me in a round of applause for our panelists? We'll be taking a slightly longer break now. We'll please be back here at 4:55 in time for our next panel, and maybe take this time to talk to each other about your mental health, talk to the people that you've brought, and really think about deconstructing some of the things we've talked about today. Bye, Mike. Huge. Well done, guys. You were absolutely fire. That was so good.
Thank you very much for having me.
You dropped some real truth bombs, you guys. Oh my god. Somebody just dropped some real